An original.
From Story Studio Network.
Well, this will be the day, April the 4th, 2023. The circus indeed does come to town in New York. I've got 4 screens up here from networks around the world, and every one of them right now, from the UK to France, the international cable services, they're all locked on Trump Tower and taking pictures of outside the courthouse where Donald Trump will be arraigned today on the grand jury indictment. So it'll be interesting to see how many rings he brings to the circus today, because apparently now he is going to speak to the media before he goes in, pleads not guilty, and then after. Originally, it was thought that he would just get back on his plane and fly back to Florida and then have something to say there. So I would think that the toughest job next to being the judge in this case is going to be being his lawyer, because it's just going to be insane. There will be no possible way to keep him quiet. And that might raise him some money, but legally there may be more jeopardy there than we'd otherwise know. So we'll watch that with interest throughout the day. Dave Trafford here. It is Now and Next for Story Studio Network, and it being a short week, so we will not have your Ontario Politics podcast on the ledge on Friday because, well, it's Good Friday, so we're going to take the day off, but we'll be back at it a week Friday with the crew around the table, John Wright, Sabrina Nanji, and Keith Leslie. So yesterday we had a quite spirited and interesting conversation with Bob Richardson at National Public Relations, and we were talking just about the launch of the mayoral campaign here in Toronto. There was a parade of folks lining up at the clerk's office in City Hall, and they were all getting their papers filed, etc. And this is going to be an historic campaign on so many levels, just because we're having this by-election strictly for the mayor's chair, but also for the first time, the strong mayor powers are in play here. And it'll be interesting to see how much that plays out. But the question is going to be, how are we going to engage an electorate that is, I think, fatigued post-COVID, or still in COVID, as the case may be? There's a lot of, I dare say, cynicism, never mind skepticism, around a lot of things that are going on at City Hall. Can anybody get anything done? The last provincial election, we had a morose turnout. The last municipal election, last provincial election, in terms of voter engagement. So it was kind of interesting because in the middle of all, I just got off with Bob, and in popped a note into my inbox, because I subscribe to David Coletto's newsletter, and it was really interesting. And he was, I won't say lamenting, but perhaps posing the issues and the challenges that we're going to have if we start reading polling numbers too closely. We're going to have to look at them a little differently. So David joins us now. He is the CEO and founder at Abacus Data. How are you?
I'm well, Dave. Good to see you.
Well, it was funny because I was thinking I got to talk to David about this, and then boom, your piece landed in my inbox. I thought, okay, this was the universe speaking to me, because it occurs to me, you and the likes of John Wright and Nick Nanos, and I talk to all you guys, and everybody's got a slightly different methodology, et cetera. But the one thing that you want to make sure of is that, the sampling that you do in terms of where you're getting your opinion from, that it represents, the population that you're polling. It occurred to me that, given the turnout for voter in the most recent elections, your sample base might be larger than the actual voting public that comes out and casts a ballot in the most recent elections. There's a whole bunch of issues here where voter turnout is one thing, but to your point, I think in your point yesterday was, we've got such a broad base of candidates. And many, well, I would say 6 or 8 of them probably have a shot at winning this. That makes the horse race polling kind of tough, doesn't it?
It does. And I think I was trying to wrap my head around, has this happened before? I mean, it's not just how crowded, and another candidate announced today, and there's more to come, I'm sure. It's not just how crowded that ballot's going to be. It's also a very short campaign, relatively speaking. I think from day one of official registration yesterday, it's like 84 days until election day. Now that's longer than a federal election, but my point is most of the candidates running are not household names in the city, right? They are current elected officials, past elected officials, former police chief, but I would say all of them are known probably in parts of the city or are known citywide notionally, but people haven't seen them in their day-to-day lives on a regular basis. And so so if you look at polling as an example, and there's been two polls out already around this race, and both of them kind of said two very different things. What we all know about polling at this early stage in a race like this is that it's likely measuring name recognition as opposed to the actual appeal or likely support that these candidates will get when this campaign is over. Mm-hmm. And so, my piece was more of almost like a warning for us to recognize that where things start today is highly unlikely to where they're going to end in terms of who wins this and which handful of candidates might emerge as the likely contenders, right? Once we get closer to June and voting day.
Yeah, and I think that there's a certain culture, I think publicly among voters, certainly among media, where we rely on guys like you to point us in the right direction. What is it we should be looking for and talking about? So it becomes almost a vicious circle there because, to your point, you're kind of warning us to say this is going to be an unusual presentation of polling data. And so be careful how we read them. I mean, there's going to have to be this big label on this almost every time. This is the snapshot that we took at this hour on this day, and this is what it means. It could be completely irrelevant by the time you look at it 3 days from now.
And, media and everybody are fascinated, and there's always more engagement on that question, that horse race question. Who are you going to vote for, right? And I actually think it's the least interesting and the least important question at this stage of the election. Would be far more valuable, and I assume the campaigns themselves, if they're doing research, aren't interested in how people are going to vote today. They're far more interested in what do people know about the candidates? Do they know anything at all? How does that change over time? What are the top issues? And it does feel to me, even if you look at the websites and the initial comments by most of the candidates who are running, they're all running on the same issues: housing affordability, cost of living, public safety and crime, and just getting around the city, whether it's by car or transit. And all of them are going to offer up solutions to those questions. And so the value of polling really is I think quite minimal if you're only asking people, how are you going to vote? And you can go back, and in the piece I went back and I looked at a few recent Canadian municipal elections. I think in Toronto a good one is the 2003 mayoral election, the one in which David Miller ultimately won and defeated John Tory. But if you looked at the early polls in that race, Barbara Hall should have easily run away with that election, and she ended up only getting 9% of the vote, and well back in third with Tory and Miller fighting it out in the final days. And so if you only use those early polls, your perception of where this race was going and the possible appeal of these candidates, I think would be misguided.
Yeah, and I also think that the reliance on the horse race, because it's sort of an easy top line to look at from whether it's social media or just general media, that's problematic these days because, as I said, it's more of a snapshot. But here, and you will know this better than anybody, when there is a variation in the final official vote off of the numbers that came out from the various pollsters over the weeks preceding. Well, you guys blew it. You got it wrong. We can never trust you. So on the one hand, we put you up on the cross to just when it's all over, but we rely on that data to drive us through and have the media narrative. So it's a funny place for us to be in terms of where polling is in our own and how we see it in terms of informing the issues. Because it's the other way around. I think most people would look at it and you say, well, what are people interested in, or what are the issues that they're, I think a lot of people are looking at the pollster and saying, what is it that we should be interested in? So there's a funny dynamic there, right?
There is. And it's a weird, complicated relationship, I would say, between the pollster and, journalists and then the broader public who consume, the content that folks like you, are putting out there. And I think at the end of the day, and this is why at least Abacus, and I know, John Wright, I'm a big fan of, and he's done this in his career, is to dig a little deeper, right? Like just putting out one question on how people would vote if the election were held hypothetically today, doesn't often bring much value. And so it is about digging a little bit deeper and asking people not just what are the issues that are important, but what kind of mayor do you want, right? And what are the challenges that people see as facing this city? And you mentioned, a sense of paralysis or not being able to actually get anything done. And then over time, understanding whether such a crowded field, are any of these candidates breaking through? Are they connecting? I mean, you started our conversation by talking about how today's the day that Donald Trump's going to get indicted and fingerprinted. There's no chance that anyone else is going to be able to be part of the conversation today, any other topic, right? And that's going to probably dominate now for the next few weeks. So all the candidates who registered yesterday, I think were strategically smart to do it because that was there maybe one moment in the next week in which they're going to get any share of the conversation given what's going to happen. And that you talked about the circus in Toronto. The circus in New York also is well underway. And so that's the real challenge. You mentioned it. How do you get people's attention these days? Because what we saw in our research during the pandemic is that this was a one moment, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, when people were so uncertain about what it meant and they were captivated by the story and the numbers of cases going up and down at any given day. Everybody was tuning in. Everybody was watching. I think we've now hit a point where people are just fatigued, right? Like I did some polling just on federal politics, for example. It's almost like we forgot about the fact that, there's the story about Chinese interference in elections, and David Johnston gets appointed by the Prime Minister to be the special rapporteur. Within 5 days, we did a survey that said half of Canadians didn't even know that had happened. So that's an indicator to me that on a very rare occasion are you going to be able to break through. And so that's one of the biggest challenges for these candidates is how do you break through? And an analogy I love to use when it comes to voting and politics is like going to a restaurant, right? And in a typical election where you've got 3 or 4 major parties, and if you're living in a constituency, those parties are represented by individual candidates. When you step into the ballot box or when you're considering your choices, because it's a partisan election, you usually are inclined in one direction. I'm a liberal, I'm a New Democrat, I'm a conservative. And so you start, halfway down the path to picking off that menu based on that identity that you might have. But in a nonpartisan municipal election with already, 28 candidates on that menu, you walk into that restaurant and you are overwhelmed by choice. And so one instinct might be, I can't choose. How do I decide, right? The other is, I'm going to ask, the waiter or the chef to make a recommendation. And this is where in an election like this, folks like you, Dave, and others who have some influence are going to be really important in helping voters distinguish between who is a contender, who has the experience and the outlook to do this job, and who are kind of the pretenders in a way. And that's what this first month of this campaign, I think, is all going to be about. And because candidates can register up until mid-May, really, and actually deregister, I guess, and take their name off the ballot, this first month is really going to be like the primary, if we use an American election analogy, where all of these candidates are going to be trying to get into that top tier. And so in a way, polling is valuable, to your point about helping us understand who that is. But given the challenges of really accurately polling the state of the race, because name recognition will be so low for so many of these candidates, it may not be an accurate measure of who's in it to win and who may not be able to get to that next stage.
I may be asking you a question that is one of these unanswerable things, but I was listening to Politicology recently, and it was basically funded by the sort of the Lincoln Project originally. They've gone off and they've done a separate podcast on it. But one of the phrases that came up, and they were talking about how they were going to measure momentum politically in the United States, and they talked about negative bipartisanship. This idea that it's just about tearing something down, and that becomes the rallying cry. So it's interesting to hear two things happen in the week leading up to yesterday's registration day, and that was to say, everything's in the toilet, so I'm going to be that guy or that woman that's going to save us all from it. It's the federal liberals' problem because they have abandoned us. And, as great a guy as John Tory was, there's a but and then a ... Do you find now when you're doing the survey that resonates more? That's more of a motivator, say, than, I want a guy who can come in here and, make sure that we've got the subway's going to run on time. And so there's more of a positive visionary element to it. Or I want, Mitzi Hunter has the handle on this particular subject and she understands the issues that Scarborough is dealing with. And if we can float Scarborough's boat better, the whole city is going to, there's some visionary conversation. My sense is that it tends more to this negative bipartisanship. It crosses all political lines.
I've been so interested in that topic, and I think we see it I think American politics has been driven by it now probably for a decade. I'm voting for you because I hate your opponent more. That becomes right. The motivation, right? Think of the 2016 presidential election. A lot of people voted for Donald Trump because they just despised Hillary Clinton so much that they just couldn't vote for her. And so I'll accept this fault, this highly broken and faulty option because it's not Hillary. And I think you see that even in federal politics today with Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre. Both of them are flawed in a lot of people's minds. And so the question is, which one do I hate least? And that may be my best choice. In a race with, a dozen or so viable candidates, somebody could win with, say, 20% of the vote. That becomes the incentive for the kind of campaign you might see. So, and you're already starting to see it. You're starting to see for example, some of the debates and attacks on candidates like Anna Baio or Brad Bradford and pointing to their record as counselors as opposed to what they're trying to offer. And I suspect Mitzi Hunter's going to face the wrath of those who hate Kathleen Wynne and provincial liberals. And Mark Saunders is getting, heat for being Doug Ford's so-called, preferred candidate, as opposed to us actually arguing and debating about whether they are the right person for the job. We're going to be tearing them down in a way to raise why they shouldn't have the job. So I think that turns voters off, frankly. I think there's a real, political, if I mind painting you with the same brush here, David, political hacks like us love the game of politics, right? We see it as it's important, but it's also a game. Who's up, who's down, who's saying what and whatever. But the average voter is paying very little attention to this on a day-to-day basis. And genuinely, they are asking, who's going to make my life better, right? Who's going to get this city back onto the right direction? Because, we did a poll just before John Tory resigned, and it did show, I think, a sense in the city of not that everything's in the crapper, right? But we're going around the toilet bowl, right? We're spinning around it, and if we don't stop this trajectory, things are going to get really bad before they get better. And so I do think there is a desire for that. The problem is, or the challenge is, any candidate breaking through with a positive message is really difficult, as you just said. And so in a weird, strange way, the system produces the kind of campaign that's going to actually turn a lot of voters off, which leads to disengagement, as you said, and lower turnout. So, on the surface, you look at this race, it's short. It's in the spring, which is a nicer time to be campaigning and be, people are going to hopefully be in a little better mood. It's likely going to be a very close election. So all of those are variables that suggest turnout should actually go up. The question is, will it? And will the noise of this campaign, like imagine, I don't live in Toronto, thankfully, in the next few months, because imagine how many robocalls you're going to get with,
Exactly.
a dozen plus candidates all running, trying to get your attention, right? It's going to probably feel overwhelming in a way that it's like if you lived in a swing state in the United States, if you lived in Ohio or Florida. Like, I don't know if you've ever traveled during a presidential election. I was in Nevada during the midterms last year, and literally every ad on TV, every single ad was about the Senate race in that state, right? Now, we're not going to likely see in Toronto that kind of advertising because parties aren't going to be able to raise the kind of, the candidates aren't going to raise that amount of money, but they're going to find other ways of trying to get the voters' attention. And that can also be really annoying and turn people off as well.
Well, it's just all of that living in that soup that is social media. I even saw some of this morning. There's a long thread taking on Brad Bradford. It has nothing to do with his record at City Hall, has nothing to do with his plan for City Hall, had everything to do with the people who are in his organizing group. I mean, that's just how down in the weeds some of this stuff gets, right?
I had an experience with this. So in Ottawa, anyways, I was involved heavily with Mark Sutcliffe, who's the current mayor of Ottawa. He's a close friend of mine. I did some polling and was active in his campaign. And the thing I learned the most, I wrote a piece at the end of that campaign, and the conclusion I took is Twitter is not real life.
Amen. Yeah.
Right? If you only watched Twitter, Mark would not have won that election. That voters only cared about, to your point, who's on his campaign and what he's written in the past. But when you actually took a step back and you looked at, what issues people wanted and the kind of mayor they wanted, Mark was exactly what a majority of people were looking for, and he ended up easily winning that election. And so that's why the first rule of campaigns is get the candidate off social media, because if they see any of that, how could you possibly, want to be in that job or campaign for it? Which is why I think we're also seeing, at least I think it's great news that so many people want to be mayor of Toronto, but that's the exception, I think. Most good people say, I want nothing to do with it because of what happens on a platform like Twitter.
Yeah, all that baggage is, beyond exceptional in terms of what you have to carry around. Before you go, wouldn't be remiss if I didn't get your take on Elections Ontario calling for a ban on polling during I guess it's the last 2 weeks of a campaign. John Wright and I have talked about this over the years a number of times, and even before we kind of had I think there's a larger group of pollsters out there now. The social media amplification actually changes a lot of that dynamic based on the way it was 10 years ago for sure. It's funny when we started talking about how the polls kind of reflect a snapshot, but do they affect the vote? Do they not affect the vote? Are they actually monitoring how people feel? I can see why there's I won't say a concern. There's an issue here that perhaps in the last provincial election was the example that people would have thought, Doug's got it. I don't have to show up. This is over. I'm not going to bother. Just curious to get your take on that.
I've got a bias, obviously, as a pollster. I'm not.
That's why I asked you.
Yeah, I'm not someone who thinks it's a good policy or it's even needed. I think there's evidence in academic research and elsewhere that polls can influence people's choices. There's no doubt, like any other sources of information. I argued it's the equivalent of the chief electoral for saying, let's just ban advertising because it moves people or it affects the way they think about politics or their choices. I think there's, people did not vote in the Ontario election because they thought only that Doug Ford was going to win. Doug Ford was going to win, whether they likely showed up or not. And I think that is often understated is when you look at those who vote and those who don't vote, it's very rare to find an example where those who didn't vote would have voted fundamentally differently than those who actually showed up. And so that idea that somehow, the polls signaling a landslide win for a candidate or a party is somehow going to take people away. On the other hand, if you had no polls that suggested the election was really close, or that a candidate that you really despise was on the cusp of winning, and you didn't know that, and so you went and you voted for a choice that had no chance of winning, is that also democratic? Is that also good, right? So I think I'm obviously a believer in high quality research. We've got to be very transparent, and we've got to make sure that research is as good as it can be. But I don't think the solution is let's ban it. And two, I don't even know if you can enforce it, let alone, how do you stop other data getting into the system? Worse, perhaps, is, journalists and observers of elections are still going to be searching for clues of who's ahead and who's behind and who has momentum. And as I said earlier, if you're using Twitter or social media as an example of that, you're probably going to get a very different perspective. Or you start counting lawn signs, or there's other ways you can do it. All of them are less effective, I think, than a high quality public opinion survey. So, for various reasons, I think it's not likely going to happen. And two, I don't think it's going to help. I do think there's maybe value in a blackout period a few days before an election, right? So then those final days aren't all about the horse race in terms of the coverage of the campaign. But I do think that, and there are countries in the world that do that. Italy and a number of European countries don't allow you to release a poll a week or less before voting day. But I think to say 2 weeks out when a campaign is usually only 4 weeks means, voters wouldn't have known in the 2011 election that the NDP was gaining steam in Quebec and would actually be the primary alternative to Stephen Harper, right? People outside of Quebec wouldn't have known that. And you wouldn't have allowed people to make an informed choice about what outcome they actually really wanted.
Yeah, I'm not sure we want to hold Italy up as the example of elections,
Good
but
point.
I get your point. David Coletto, thank you for joining us. You can find David's newsletter. It's in focus with David Coletto at Abacus. Good of you to join us. Hope you'll come back.
I will always come back. Thanks, David.
Very good. Now and Next is produced by Becky Coles. Our production manager is Jamie Nickerson. Audio editors are Mike Trutler and Drew Garner. And our sonic logo designer is Greg McDonald. Our executive producers are Dave and Aaron Trafford.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.